So I'd like to start out by asking you a question. You guys, and I'll open it up to everybody here because it's, we'll all work together on this. Does anybody know who Andy Johnson is?
No.
Nobody? I didn't think so.
Andrew
So the reason is he didn't get a lot of press. There was no national coverage about him. There was no story in the New York Times. But his story is very important, and I think you'll see why. So Andy Johnson, he was a farmer in Wyoming, had some land, had some cattle, everything was great. He had a creek on his land, and he wanted to build a pond, a stock pond, to water his cattle. Not a big deal. So what he did is he went and got all the local and state permits that he needed, and everybody was happy about it, and he built his pond. Everything was great. Until one day, 2 years after he built it, he got a notice from some folks that weren't so happy about it, and that was the Environmental Protection Agency. So they came a knocking, figuratively, and they said, "Hey, congratulations on your pond. We're going to come after you for it." And he said, "Why? What did I do? I built a pond." And they said, "Your pond violates the Clean Water Act. And because of that, we're going to charge you a fine, and we're going to charge you $37,000 per day that this pond exists because it violates this law." And he said, "All right, hold on. This is crazy. $37,000 a day for a pond?" And see, what happened is the EPA has the Clean Water Act, and they're responsible for mandating it. And it's designed to give them authority to regulate navigable U.S. waterways. It's kind of strange. There's not much of a connection between a pond and that. And in addition to that, Andy, he looked into it, and then he went back and he asked him, and he said, "Isn't there an exception in the Clean Water Act for stock ponds?" There is. But he asked them this repeatedly, and guess what he got back?
Nothing.
Crickets. Nothing. Because the EPA didn't have to justify it, but that didn't stop them from prosecuting him. And what ended up happening is he ended up amassing over $16 million in fines to the EPA. But thankfully, he didn't take it lying down, and there was actually a group that helped him with his legal defense. And he prosecuted the EPA and said, this isn't right. This is not according to what the law is in the legislation or the regulations. So he fought it for 2 years, and he was successful. He ended up getting the EPA to basically admit that what they had done was wrong. So when I heard this story, one of my first reactions was, why? Of all the things, America's a big country, the EPA has a lot to do, there's a lot of much more pressing environmental issues. Why this one guy on this one farm in Wyoming? And the interesting thing is, I couldn't find why. And we're never going to find why. Because all Andy ever was up against was a big faceless bureaucracy. All you'll ever find looking at the story is spokespeople for the EPA. So we don't know exactly why. To me, it sounds like some kind of crazy personal vendetta against Andy Johnson. But we don't know. Maybe it was somebody that just didn't like him and tried to ruin his life, but we'll never know. Because all we know is that Andy Johnson didn't even get to face his accuser or the witnesses against him. He just had the bureaucracy. And the scary thing is, that could happen to anybody. Because the fact of the matter is, we don't know how many laws and regulations there are on a daily basis that we might be in violation of. Or even if we're not in violation of them, that there might not be an agency that tries to come after us, and then we're on the hook to defend ourselves. And we could end up 2 years in court like Andy did. Just out of curiosity, does anybody know about how many laws and regulations, federal, are on the books?
Thousands.
Thousands?
Tens of thousands.
Could bet hundreds.
Tens of thousands. Hundreds of thousands. I have to apologize. It's a bit of a trick question, because the actual answer is nobody knows. There are estimates, and there's an idea, but nobody actually has a specific number. There are in the ballpark of hundreds of thousands. There's about 300,000 regulations, and between 3,600 and 4,500 laws. But nobody actually has an exact number. That's crazy. I think that's crazy. I think you guys are on board with that. And if our legislators don't know how many laws there are, do you think that they know what are in the laws?
No.
And if they don't know what's in the laws, how are we supposed to know what's in the law? But that's where we are, and that's where Andy Johnson was.
It's a giant
career manufacturing machine.
Yes.
I'm recently retired from my business, and we actually are in the environmental business. We make filters that are used to recycle industrial wastewater. Sounds like a really good thing. So we know a little bit about the wastewater industry, and we have a wastewater system in our factory in Tewksbury, Mass, and we are in compliance with everything that we needed to be in compliance with, but we found ourselves looking down a rat hole that we said, well, what about, is there some regulation we're not aware of that we need to, be aware of? And the bottom line is that we don't have any hazardous waste that we generate, and therefore we shouldn't have to be a registered hazardous waste generator. So, thinking that we were good, we were clear. Well, it wasn't quite that simple, because we have a compressor in our factory, an air compressor. And this air compressor has about maybe 2 cups of oil in it to lubricate the gears and the pistons. And every now and then you have to change the compressor oil, and it's just motor oil. We would buy a quart of motor oil, and we would take out the 2 cups of motor oil that was in there, and we put in fresh oil. And like in your car, motor oil can be returned to the place that you bought it, and they are required by law to take it back and dispose of it as a hazardous waste. Anybody that changes your own oil in your car. Well, we found out that that doesn't apply to industry. Industry has a different set of rules, so $17,000 later, we have a space marked off on the floor in our factory with the yellow and black tape, and we have I think it's a 2-quart container with about a half a pint of oil in it. And we have all these rules and regs, and we had to hire a consultant to make sure that we processed all the forms correctly, yada, yada, yada. We will not fill that 2-quart container of oil for 10 years. And $17,000 later, that's how the rules and regulations. Wow. But the consultant that got paid the $17,000 to make sure that we were in compliance with every aspect of hazardous waste management in our facility and licensed operators. We have like 5 engineers on site, and we consult to industries regarding how they treat their wastewater and et cetera, and how to get the contaminants out of their wastewater stream. And we had this little pH neutralization system, and we found out that although the local authority said you're good to go, here's your letter, they wouldn't give us we didn't have to get a license, we just needed a letter saying that you guys are so small, we're not gonna regulate you. You have authorization to discharge to the sewer system. So we thought we were good to go. No. We have to have licensed operators. We had to send 4 guys out to have them take the exam, get their licenses to operate that wastewater treatment system that we've been operating for almost 20 years.
Yeah.
Without a licensed operator. Technically, I was a licensed operator, but because I retired, this person has to be on site. A licensed operator has to be on site anytime the doors are open. It's like, it just, the regulations are just overbearing.
It's
and
not
ridiculous.
It's not an uncommon story. There's been a lot of stuff like that, in particular with the EPA. I mean, there are other federal agencies that have a lot of similarly overarching and overbearing things. I mean, the FDA is really no different. There's a number of things. I don't want to get too in the weeds, but they have a lot of regulations about what people are allowed to advertise as far as content and whatnot. There's actually potential that they might say, because they're saying that, almond milk and soy milk, they say that's confusing to the consumer, so they're thinking of taking the word milk out of it, because that's not going to make it more confusing to the consumer. Actually, when folks that were polled about whether or not they considered that confusing, there was less than 1 in 10 that thought that it was confusing that milk was used for soy milk. They didn't actually think it was cow's milk. Less than 1 in 10 thought it was confusing, but the FDA is thinking of pursuing that as an option. And yeah, interesting in regards to that story. The one group that's really in favor of that is actually the dairy industry, because they don't like the competition from soy milk and almond milk and all the alternatives. So they'd be thrilled if they had to strike the word milk from their product and no one will know what it is anymore or how to find it. Which kind of goes back to showing how big business kind of likes big government, because it often helps them out.
Let me add one other thing. The
Okay.
consultant that we had to hire said, don't worry about it. I work with the authorities all the time and I help them establish the regulations. And can make sure that they're common sense, they make sense, et cetera. And then you get the idea, okay, this guy has a whole business established because of these regulations.
Right, exactly.
And they're working hand in glove
Yeah.
with one another.
And it happens all the time. That's a couple of examples. But what I'd like to do is focus on, since we see all of that stuff, where did it start? And how did we get to that point? And was it always like that? And so to find out where we came from, let's go back all the way to the beginning. And in particular, in regards to the regulations and all these things we see, the 300,000 regulations and laws and whatnot, was it always like that? So let's rewind and let's ask James Madison, the father of our Constitution. When he was defending the Constitution before it was ratified, he said, in regards to federal power, that the rights and the responsibilities given to the federal government were few and defined, and the powers given to the states were numerous and undefined. So it was his view that we should be in the opposite position of where we are today. And while we're looking at that, what about some other things that are common concerns today? So what about people that end up parking themselves in Congress, right? People get into Congress, they get themselves elected, and all they want to do is focus on staying in office. And we have people that are in for decades. Well, if we look back while we're in the past and history, let's look at some examples there. So if we look at George Washington, obviously the first president, he was elected unanimously twice to office, but interestingly, he didn't want to be there. See, he viewed it as his duty to the American Republic that had just been founded to be there to help guide it along the way. But he made it very important and very clear distinction that he stepped aside after 2 terms because he didn't believe that one man should have that kind of power indefinitely. And Congress was no different at the time. The average time spent in office was fairly short, and that average time spent was like that for many years. So we have a very different view on the power of government, and we have a very different view on how long people spend. What about another topic that's of concern today? Money, finances, debt. The fiscal irresponsibility we see. What was their view back then? Again, let's look to George Washington. He said in an address to Congress that of all the fiscal concerns, the number one should be to pay down the federal debt. He said, of all the things that are left to stand in regards to the fiscal responsibility of the government, of all the things, not paying down the debt would be the most injurious. And what about spending? So that's what they viewed in debt. What about spending? Let's again look to James Madison. In an address to Congress, he said that it would be irresponsible, an affront to the American people, to propose spending and not also propose a plan on how to pay for it. That should be something that's in front of the American people for anything you propose. And that's a far cry from where we are. So we know where we started, and let's start fast forwarding through history. How did that impact early America? In regards to debt and spending, the United States was able to pay down its debts completely to zero and actually had a surplus in 1835. And that's because of the mentality, the thinking that was amongst the leadership. That's what allowed them to get to that point, because they viewed it as a top priority. Like I said, in regards to staying in office forever, George Washington set that precedent for 2 terms, and that was followed without law for more than 100 years by each president that came after him. And the average term for Congress didn't exceed a couple of years until the 50th Congress, almost 100 years later. And during that time, Congress recognized, by and large, the design of federalism that the founders had set up, the division of power between the states and the federal government. So when did things begin to change? And for that, we need to look to the 20th century. See, in the early 20th century, the ideas amongst leadership began to shift. They viewed the division of power as old-fashioned, archaic, and inefficient. They instead thought that the way forward was to be ruled by experts, to have a small group of people that really know what they're talking about at the top, with near unlimited power, and they would be able to make things happen more efficiently. And that they know best what the American people need. And the first person to really characterize this was Franklin Roosevelt. It was under his presidency that the United States increased its debt by a higher percentage than any other president before or after. In large part, that was thanks to the New Deal programs. There was a lot of spending associated with that, and most of the agencies and programs that were designed then, we still actually have today. Franklin Roosevelt was also the first president to disregard the example set by George Washington. He thought, well, if I'm popular enough to be president, why shouldn't I? There's nothing in law preventing me, and at the time there wasn't. So he ran for office 4 times and was elected 4 times. It was actually his actions doing that that led to the proposal and the passage of the 22nd Amendment, which is where we get the limitation for 2 terms of president. But see, Congress saw this going on, and they said, hold on, we want in on that too. So they decided to start pushing the boundaries of their power as well. And they thought, all right, there's this clause in the Constitution, the Commerce Clause, and we're going to try to push that a little bit, because we think that means we can just do whatever we want. Now, if you don't know, the Commerce Clause refers to a section of the Constitution that grants Congress the power to legislate, to regulate interstate commerce. And Congress said, well, what it really means is not just interstate commerce, it really means commerce in just one state, and it really means just anything that's going on in the states. And unfortunately, there was also a trend in the Supreme Court to just look the other way on this and say, you know what, it's a very tenuous connection, but it's kind of in the Constitution, you guys go for it. And so that's what they did. And that's what we've lived with basically for the last 100 years. And that brings us right back up to present. Back to Andy Johnson, back to the EPA and the thousands of regulations, back to terms of Congress. Our leaders in the House, our leader in the House and the Senate, both have been in office for over 30 years. It's not uncommon for people to be in for 30, 40, and even 50 years. And that brings us also back to the debt. We're $23.3 trillion in debt, which is astronomical. I have a hard time wrapping my head around that number. But one thing that is a lot easier to understand and comprehend is time. So I'd like to give you an example. If you were to take $1 and pay it toward the debt every second, so $1 per second to pay off the debt, does anyone have a guess on how long it would take to pay off the debt?
A few hundred years?
A few hundred years? Anybody else?
Centuries.
Come on, centuries? Getting closer.
I would guess in the thousands.
The thousands, we're getting closer, but you're still off by a few orders of magnitude. It would take over 730,000 years to pay off what we currently have on our federal debt. That's quite a problem. But the thing is, those that we send to Congress, our representation, don't seem to think it's much of a problem. And if they don't, those are the people that are going to represent us, to represent our concerns. That's their job. And if you look at the polling, most Americans are concerned with these things, with the debt and with the overreach of government, with Congress people that are staying in indefinitely. Most Americans are concerned with that, but Congress will not address it. And that was a concern held by many people. In particular, we're going to look at an example of Mark Meckler. So he was a leader in the Tea Party movement in the late 2000s, early 2010s, big movement to try to get people elected to office that ran on platforms of small government, reducing the size of government, that kind of thing. And it was largely successful. They got them in. But once they were in, nothing changed. It stayed the same. They went in, they made all these promises, and nothing changed. So Mark stepped aside. He was very discouraged by this. And he thought, well, if this didn't work, this is kind of our last hope for people to go to represent us. If they will not do it, then what else can we do? And that's when he came across a section in Article 5 in the Constitution that laid it out. And what that describes is, what Article 5 describes is how to amend the Constitution. And it describes the process that was used for the last 17 amendments that were passed. You recall the first 10 were the Bill of Rights that were ratified with the Constitution originally. But there's also another section that has never been used before, and that laid out how the states could pass an amendment without Congress, without the President, and without the Supreme Court. So what they did, so the way that the process works is the states, if there's 2/3 of the states, they get together and pass a resolution through each of their houses. They can call what's referred in the Constitution to as a convention of the states. And to this, each of the states will send delegates, and there is where they would propose changes to address the things that Americans are concerned about. But it's very important to note that law isn't made at the convention. Nothing will actually change there. It's part of a 2-part process. So that's part 1. After things are proposed, it has to go back to the states to actually be ratified. And that's where it has to meet a much higher bar. So it requires 3/4 of the states to actually pass anything that's proposed. And the founders put that in there because they didn't want the chance that there would be some small interest group or a couple of minority of people to be able to make law that would affect every American. So they wanted to set the bar very high. And if you look at any national poll, you'll see it's very hard to get more than half of Americans to agree on anything, never mind 3/4. So the bar is set very high, and it's by design so that it prevents anything catastrophic from getting through. But what this does is provide us a way forward. And the way that it works is us. It's the people. It requires us, average citizens like you and me, to talk to our state representatives, our state senators, and show them these are our concerns. And not only that, but they have the power granted to them in the Constitution to be able to take our concerns and do something about it. And that's what the Convention of States movement is, and that's what the project is to get average people involved to talk to their representatives. And it's been fairly successful. There's already 15 states that have passed the resolution. It's being proposed in several more. It's currently in committee in Massachusetts. So even in states that you wouldn't think that it's necessarily popular, small government and these things, there is a lot of people that are concerned about what they see in Washington and they want to do something. So the Convention of States is the way that we see forward, and we are what make it possible.